He was a teacher in a small Austrian town, known more for his calm patience than for any love of politics. Yet in the summer of 1914, even his classroom could not shield him from the tension in Europe. News of alliances reached him in snippets, a triple entente of France, Britain, and Russia wary of Germany's new power, and a triple alliance of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy united by fear of encirclement. He overheard farmers argue about conscription and read newspapers that proclaimed peace even as armies mobilized. On June 28th, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated in Sarajevo. The teacher felt a chill. He sensed the precarious balance tipping. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia, issued an ultimatum, and when Serbia refused, began shelling Belgrade. Russia mobilized to aid Serbia. Germany mobilized in response, viewing war with Russia as inevitable. Within days, Europe's great powers marched to war. Italy, unbound by an offensive alliance, stayed neutral, and the United States declared neutrality. He knew that teaching geometry would soon give way to something far more chaotic. As trains rattled by loaded with young men singing patriotic songs, he wondered, would his students return, or would their voices become echoes lost in gunfire? Far from his village, a fisherman's son found himself standing in a French meadow, rifle in hand. He had joined the British Expeditionary Force, landing at Boulogne amid cheers and brass bands. The Schlieffen Plan, designed to encircle Paris by cutting through neutral Belgium, had propelled him into battle. Belgian resistance slowed the German advance, but he soon faced an enemy he had only imagined. At Mons, the British fought bravely but were outnumbered. Forced to retreat, they fell back alongside the French. They made their stand at the Marne River, 40 miles from Paris. In the late summer heat, he watched French taxis ferry soldiers to the front and heard bugles call desperate counterattacks that saved the city. Pushing German forces back, both sides suffered massive casualties. Exhausted, they dug trenches. He clawed at the earth with his bare hands until nails bled, creating a narrow refuge from machine gun fire and shrapnel. Within weeks, 350 miles of trenches scarred the landscape. Rats, lice, and mud became his constant companions. He wrote home of Christmas carols in no man's, land moments when soldiers from opposing sides exchanged cigarettes and sang together. Yet every dawn brought the whistle of an officer and the terrifying cry, "Over the top." After each night's barrage, he asked himself, how long could a man exist between rat-infested mud below and death screaming overhead? Across the channel, a young nurse volunteered for the French Red Cross. She had trained in a hospital where clean sheets and fresh water were available. At the Western Front, she encountered a different reality. Endless convoys of wounded, their uniforms caked with blood and mud. She and her fellow nurses wore white aprons that quickly turned scarlet. Thousands of women served in support roles during the war: nurses, ambulance drivers, clerks. Many women took jobs previously denied to them. Factories employed them in shipyards and munitions plants, dramatically increasing their presence in the workforce. In field hospitals near Ypres, she treated soldiers with shattered limbs and gas burns, often intense with makeshift equipment. She saw the introduction of antiseptics and new surgical techniques, but also the limitations of medicine when confronted with high explosives. She noted how women disguised themselves as men to fight, only to be dismissed if discovered. Others found heroism in resistance and espionage. She took solace in small victories. saving a leg, comforting a dying man with a letter from home. She also heard whispers that their work might lead to something beyond the war voting rights and a new place in society. Indeed, nations like Denmark, Norway, and Canada expanded suffrage during the conflict. Each time she closed a soldier's eyes and folded his hands, she wondered whether the world would remember their sacrifice or if she would merely vanish back into anonymity when the guns fell silent. Thousands of miles east, a young Russian peasant was conscripted into the Tsar's army. He knew little of Europe's alliances, but felt pride in defending his homeland. Russia's armies marched into East Prussia, only to suffer disastrous defeats at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes. Poor communications, uncoded wireless, messages intercepted by German forces, and outdated equipment doomed them. Within 6 weeks, Russia lost nearly 1/3 men. He wrote to his sister about marching barefoot in winter and fighting without bullets. She sent bread that often arrived moldy. News of their comrades' suffering reached Petrograd. Bread shortages and staggering casualties led to riots and revolution. The Tsar abdicated. A provisional government promised reform yet continued the war. Soldiers like him began deserting in droves. He was torn between loyalty to his regiment and the cries of peasants demanding peace. In whispers around campfires, men debated slogans like peace, land, bread. He feared that returning home might mean facing new enemies, fellow Russians with different visions for the future. As he shivered in a trench on the Eastern Front, a far more profound question plagued him. If the Tsar's divine right had vanished overnight, what other certainties could crumble? In the sweltering heat of German East Africa, a local farmer named Mwita shouldered a heavy load of ammunition. He was recruited as a porter to support German Schutztruppe forces led by Lieutenant Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. Mwita understood little of European politics, but knew his life now belonged to the war. The East African campaign comprised battles and guerrilla actions across German East Africa. Mozambique, Rhodesia, British East Africa, Uganda, and the Belgian Congo. Lettow-Vorbeck aimed to tie down Allied troops, diverting them from the Western Front. Mwita trekked through dense jungle and across the savannah. They raided farms for supplies. Sometimes they exchanged goods peacefully with villages, other times forcefully. He saw the cruelty of war inflicted on civilians and porters alike. Disease claimed more lives than bullets: malaria, dysentery, and sleeping sickness. Mwita watched British and Belgian forces invade his homeland. He saw his neighbors conscripted by both sides. When the Germans crossed into Portuguese East Africa in 1917 to raid supplies, Mwita wondered if this war would ever reach Berlin or London, or if his own land would bear its scars forever. Carrying a worn ammunition crate through the bush, he whispered to himself, would any of the world's leaders ever know the weight he had borne for their ambitions? On the sun-baked hills of the Sinai Peninsula, a Turkish conscript stood guard, his rifle trained on the shimmering horizon. The Ottoman Empire had joined the Central Powers, seeking to regain lost territories and defend its sovereignty. British forces advanced across the desert from Egypt, but were thrown back at the First and Second Battles of Gaza. Meanwhile, in Arabia, Bedouin rebels led by local chiefs and guided by British officer T.E. Lawrence captured the strategic port of Aqaba. The soldier heard conflicting tales that the Ottomans were fighting for Islamic unity, that their leaders betrayed them by favoring Germans, that the British promised Arabs independence while simultaneously supporting a Jewish homeland in Palestine through the Balfour Declaration. He swore loyalty to the Sultan Caliph, but watched his empire strained from all sides. The Caucasus saw Russian incursions. Mesopotamia witnessed British advances. The Ottoman soldier fought at Gaza and later retreated toward Jerusalem, where British troops entered the city in late 1917. He felt pride and despair in equal measure. Letters from home described shortages and rising resentment against German advisors. Despite this, he clung to his rifle, determined to defend his homeland until commanded otherwise. As he scanned the dunes, he silently asked, would history remember his stand among the great battles? Or would his story be lost beneath shifting sands? Back in Britain, a factory whistle blared as dawn broke. A young woman named Margaret, once a maid, now fitted detonators into artillery shells. Munitions factories had become the lifeblood of the war, employing thousands of women. She wore trousers and a scarf, her hair tucked safely away. The chemicals turned her skin yellow, earning workers like her the nickname canaries. Posters encouraged women to work, not mentioning the dangers. Many worked 10 to 12 hours, 6 days a week. She felt pride in contributing, but also fear. Several women had died in accidental explosions. At lunch, she and her friends sang parodies of popular songs to boost morale. She saved her wages to support her younger siblings. She also joined suffrage meetings, believing that their contribution to the war would strengthen their case for voting rights. When news of food shortages reached her caused by the German U-boat blockade and Britain's own blockade of Germany, she volunteered in rationing campaigns. Her father, too old to fight, tended a victory garden. The war had transformed their street. Men gone, women at machines, children playing at soldiers. Yet newspapers carried casualty lists that seemed endless. Each time she tightened a fuse and passed the shell along, she wondered, would the weapon protect a friend at the front or take someone else as father from them? As 1915 turned to 1916, the war showed no signs of ending. Leaders on both sides began to pursue a war of attrition, grinding down the enemy through sheer loss. In the West, the Germans prepared a massive offensive at Verdun, vowing they shall not pass, while the Allies planned their own onslaught along the river Somme. Our teacher-turned-soldier read rumors of these offensives in letters. The nurse stocked supplies. The Russian conscript worried about revolution. Mwita marched deeper into the bush. The Turkish soldier wondered if he would soon face tanks. And Margaret tightened more fuses. They all sensed that something monstrous loomed. None of them could yet fathom the scale of the battles that were coming: Verdun, the Somme, and a mutiny within the French army that would test the very core of resilience and honor. What trials awaited them in the months ahead? By February 1916, the teacher who had become a French infantryman found himself marching through snow toward the fortified city of Verdun. German commander Erich von Falkenhayn aimed to bleed France white, believing that if the French army suffered enough casualties at a place of national pride, it would be forced to sue for peace. Over 10 months, Verdun claimed roughly 365,000 French and 340,000 German casualties. Each hill Mort Arm, Hill 304, Fort Douaumont, became synonymous with slaughter. The soldier saw entire units disappear in waves of shrapnel and machine gun fire. He carried wounded men whose uniforms melted to their skin and wrote letters for those whose hands were blown away. After months, the German attack stalled. Falkenhayn was dismissed and replaced by Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff. The French had held, but at an unimaginable cost. When he finally left Verdun, he was gaunt, his hair prematurely gray. He had witnessed not a decisive battle, but a grinding machine that devoured men. As he staggered away from the Meuse, he heard rumors of a new offensive on the Somme. Would this one break the stalemate or simply consume more lives? The British soldier, the Somme's muddy graves. The fisherman's son, now hardened by months of trench warfare, prepared for the Anglo-French offensive along the River Somme. The plan was to break through German lines and relieve pressure on Verdun. On the 1st of July 1916, after a week-long artillery bombardment meant to obliterate German defenses, he climbed from his trench and advanced across no man's land. The bombardment had failed. German machine guns cut down rows of men. In a single day, 57,000 British soldiers became casualties, with nearly 19,000 killed. It was the worst day in British military history, yet the battle raged on for 5 months. Day after day, he waded through mud so deep it could drown a horse. He watched friends sink and vanish. He saw shells crater entire villages, leaving only shattered spires poking through the mud. Near the village of Fleurs, he glimpsed lumbering metal beasts emerging from the smoke tanks. They broke through barbed wire and crushed trenches, but they were few in number and prone to breaking down. The Somme offensive eventually gained just 10 miles at a cost of around 600,000 Allied casualties and approximately 450,000 German. High Command comforted themselves that Germany would run out of men first. He wondered how many more British sons would be sacrificed to find out. As winter set in and the guns fell briefly silent, he questioned, if this was a victory, what would defeat look like? In a hospital outside Amiens, the young nurse from the Red Cross faced a relentless influx of shattered bodies. Verdun and the Somme had sent her more patients than she had ever imagined possible. She cleaned wounds clogged with mud and metal, performed amputations, and comforted soldiers screaming from phantom pains. She noted how the war's escalation had brought innovations, blood transfusions to prevent shock, antiseptic dressings to reduce infection, and even rudimentary psychotherapy for men suffering shell shock. Yet nothing could prepare her for the psychological toll of seeing thousands of young men maimed. The smell of rotting flesh and carbolic acid clung to her hair. She also heard distant news. In the east, Russian General Alexei Brusilov launched a massive offensive against Austria-Hungary, achieving stunning breakthroughs and inflicting catastrophic losses. Romania joined the war, but soon suffered a devastating counterattack. Its army was overrun, with 250,000 casualties. These events echoed in the hospital as new languages and uniforms appeared. The nurse comforted Romanian soldiers and listened to Slavic songs sung through clenched teeth. She saw the war's global web tightening, drawing in nations she had never imagined. Between surgeries, she wrote in her journal about women who disguised themselves as men and fought, only to be expelled if discovered. She wondered whether her own sacrifice would be remembered, or if society would expect her to return to domestic life when the guns finally fell silent. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw faces from Verdun and the Somme. She prayed the next offensives would be different, but whispers of a new strategy attrition left her uneasy. In the east, the young Russian conscript found himself participating in the Brusilov Offensive, the most successful Allied assault of the war. General Brusilov employed innovative tactics, using shorter artillery barrages and surprise attacks to punch through Austro-Hungarian lines. For the first time, the soldiers saw enemy trenches overrun in a matter of hours. He captured Austro-Hungarian soldiers, some of whom surrendered willingly. But success came at a price. Russian casualties were enormous, and the army's fragile supply system collapsed. He heard that Romania had entered the war, only to be swiftly crushed. He heard about the sinking of the passenger ship S. Housatonic by a German U-boat and of Germany's promise to Mexico in the Zimmermann telegram. He sensed the global tension rising. At home, breadlines grew, and the Tsar's promises rang hollow. Soldiers muttered about mutiny. Peasants demanded land. Then came February 1917. Demonstrations in Petrograd, soldiers joining protesters, the Tsar abdicating. A provisional government formed but continued the war. Desertion rates skyrocketed. He deserted with his comrades, boarding a train packed with soldiers singing revolutionary songs. On the journey back to his village, he clutched his rifle and wondered if he would need it again, this time against his own countrymen. As he stepped off the train amid cheers for peace, land, bread, he sensed that his battlefields might shift from foreign trenches to the streets of Russia itself. High in the Dolomites, an Italian conscript clung to a rocky ledge overlooking the Isonzo River. Italy had joined the Allies in 1915, lured by promises of territory. Since then, he had fought in a series of brutal assaults against Austro-Hungarian positions, 11 battles in 2 years. The terrain was treacherous, sheer cliffs, avalanches, and artillery that echoed for miles. At the 11th Battle of the Isonzo in 1917, Italian and Austro-Hungarian forces battered each other into exhaustion. He felt both pride and futility. Each offensive gained a ridge or a few hundred meters of ground, only to be lost again. Rumors reached him of the Brusilov Offensive and Romania's fall. He heard that generals promised breakthroughs but delivered only more graves. When he heard of a fresh Austro-German offensive massing near Caporetto, he sensed that their precarious line might soon crumble. But for now, he clung to his mountain, rifle in hand, watching for flares in the dark and listening to the wind howl through the passes. As the autumn mists crept down the mountainside, he asked, would the next avalanche be of snow or of enemy soldiers breaking through? Far south, Mwita continued to carry ammunition and food for German Schutztruppe. The war dragged on. Leto Vorbeck's strategy of tying down Allied forces persisted. Mwita marched deeper into the bush, crossing into Portuguese Mozambique in late 1917. Living off Portuguese supplies and local farms, he saw other Africans conscripted as porters for British, Belgian, and Portuguese armies. The landscape became both battlefield and resource. Villages were burned by both sides to deny supplies to the enemy. Mwita's own village had been torched by retreating Germans to prevent the British from using it. Diseases, malaria, dysentery, sleeping sickness ravaged their ranks. He buried friends who had never fired a shot. He watched Allied soldiers die from tsetse fly bites. Sometimes he wondered whether any of the European commanders knew or cared about the toll on African lives. The Germans continued fighting even after hearing rumors of an armistice in Europe. Finally surrendering on the 25th of November 1918, Mwita did not know this yet. As of 1917, he had no sense of an end. He only knew that his weary legs continued to carry the war deeper into the continent. Each time he lifted a crate onto his shoulders, he looked to the horizon and whispered, would he ever walk this land in peace again? On the coastal plain near Gaza, the Ottoman artilleryman crouched behind sandbags, adjusting the angle of his field gun. British forces launched their first 2 attacks across the Sinai in early 1917, but Ottoman troops repelled them. The artillerymen celebrated these victories, believing they showed the empire's resilience. Yet he could not ignore other news. The Arab rebels had taken Aqaba. British troops were advancing up the Tigris and had captured Baghdad. The Caucasus Front was collapsing after the Russian Revolution. And in Europe, the Allies were massing resources that seemed inexhaustible. In July 1917, he heard of the Balfour Declaration, a British promise to support a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. He wondered what that meant for the Arabs fighting alongside and against him. In autumn, the British finally broke through at Gaza, paving the way for an advance into Palestine. He was forced to retreat through towns he had grown up visiting. By December, British General Edmund Allenby entered Jerusalem, ending 400 years of Ottoman rule. The gunner was exhausted and demoralized, yet he continued to fight. Rumors swirled of new fronts, new treaties, new loyalties. His empire was unraveling, but he could not yet see where he would stand when the threads were cut. Watching British troops march into Jerusalem, he wondered whether his homeland would survive the war and if he would have a place in whatever future emerged. In Britain, Margaret's life in the munitions factory remained grueling. The war of attrition meant more shells, more shifts, more danger. Posters urged workers to do their bit, but she knew that each shell she assembled might take a life. She heard about Verdun and the Somme. Friends wept over names in the casualty lists. She read about the Easter Rising in Dublin, when Irish nationalists had attempted to shake off British rule, only to be crushed amid wartime. Martial law, no citation available. The news unsettled her. Not all was unity on the home front. In early 1917, she learned that Germany had resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. Merchant ships sank and food shortages worsened. Britain introduced rationing. She queued for bread and sugar. Then came the Housatonic sinking and the revelation of the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany urged Mexico to join a war against the United States. She sensed that the war's center of gravity might shift. In April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany, promising fresh troops and resources. She didn't know any Americans, but she hoped their arrival might hasten the end of the conflict. At the same time, convoys began escorting merchant ships, gradually reducing shipping losses and turning the tide in the U-boat war. As she tightened yet another fuse, she whispered, would American soldiers, strangers from across the ocean, be the key to ending a war that had consumed Europe for 3 years? Far from the muddy trenches, a German naval officer stood in the cramped control room of a U-boat. His vessel's mission was simple: sink Allied shipping to starve Britain into submission. He believed in Germany's cause and admired the stealth and efficiency of submarines. Yet he also knew that the decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare risked dragging neutral nations into the conflict. When his crew torpedoed the SS Housatonic, an American steamer carrying wheat, he watched through a periscope as sailors abandoned ship. He recorded the event in his log, noting no loss of life, but a chill crept down his spine. Then the Zimmermann telegram was intercepted and made public. He heard U-boat commanders grumble that the Foreign Office had been foolish to propose German-Mexican alliance against the United States. In April 1917, the United States declared war. The officer felt both regret and defiance. His missions would now face American destroyers. Convoys, depth charges, and new listening devices made the seas more dangerous. Each patrol was a gamble between crippling Allied supply lines and surviving the increasingly effective Allied anti-submarine tactics. As he listened to the ping of a British sonar and the creak of pressure on the hull, he wondered, would Germany's gamble pay off, or had it sealed their fate? Across the Atlantic, a young mechanic from Kansas watched headlines about the Lusitania, Verdun, and the Somme with growing unease. He had always dreamed of flying. When the United States declared war in April 1917, he enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Service. After months of training, he sailed to Europe, joining the newly formed American squadrons under British and French tutelage. He learned to fly Sopwith camels and Neoports, mastering the art of aerial combat. Above the trenches, the skies were increasingly crowded. Reconnaissance aircraft directed artillery fire. Fighters tried to shoot them down. He memorized the names of aces: Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, René Fonck, Eddie Rickenbacker. He knew that by 1918, the Allies would achieve air superiority thanks to greater resources. Yet in 1917, German aircraft still dominated at times, leading to heavy Allied losses in what became known as Bloody April. He flew patrols over Flanders, chasing Black Crosses through clouds and diving on enemy balloons. Each sortie offered exhilaration and terror. He also saw the war from above trenches like scars, explosions like blooming flowers of earth, rivers winding through desolation. He realized that his small biplane might tip the scales in ways unimaginable just years before. He wrote home about comrades lost and the thrill of a successful dogfight, hiding the dread he felt every time he strapped into his cockpit. As he banked over the Ypres salient, trailing smoke, he thought, would the skies ever be peaceful again once men had learned to kill from them? By spring 1917, the French army had endured Verdun, the Somme, and countless smaller engagements. General Robert Nivelle promised that one more massive attack would break German lines and end the war. He launched this offensive on the Chemin des Dames in April. Initial success turned into bogged-down slaughter. Casualties mounted. The nurse in Amiens heard rumors. The fisherman's son saw French troops returning in disarray. In the trenches, a farm laborer from Brittany had had enough. He had fought at Verdun and the Somme. He had watched friends die for barren ridges. When orders came to prepare for another assault, his unit refused. Thousands of French soldiers mutinied, refusing to leave trenches or follow orders. They sang revolutionary songs and demanded an end to suicidal offensives. The mutineer loved his country, but felt betrayed by generals. Pétain replaced Nivelle and promised no more wasteful attacks, but he also executed ringleaders to restore discipline. The mutineer survived. He returned to fighting later that year, but something had changed. Loyalty had a new condition, not blind obedience, but belief that sacrifice would not be squandered. As he marched back to the front under a new commander, he wondered if his defiance would be remembered as betrayal or as a necessary stand that saved France from self-destruction. By late 1917, exhaustion gripped Europe. Verdun and the Somme had shattered armies. The Brusilov Offensive and Romanian collapse reshaped the Eastern Front. Italian lines teetered, and Caporetto loomed. Mutiny and revolution threatened the Allies from within, while U-boats stalked the seas. Yet new forces gathered. America was mobilizing. Convoys were beating back submarines. The Arab revolt was gaining momentum, and Russian soldiers were abandoning the war for revolution. The war seemed poised to pivot. With winter descending and 1918 approaching, each character felt a sense of suspended breath. Would the next year bring victory, collapse, or something unexpected? The answer would depend on a spring offensive planned in Berlin, a wave of influenza waiting in the shadows, and the arrival of millions of fresh American soldiers ready to test their mettle on fields far from home. This completes the second third of the expanded narrative. It carries the story through Verdun, the Somme, the Brusilov Offensive, Italian battles, East African campaigns, the Middle Eastern theater, mutinies, the resumption of U-boat warfare, and America's entry into the war. The final section, third, will explore 1918, the German Spring Offensive, the arrival of American forces, the collapse of empires, the influenza pandemic, and the war's end. Here is the final third of the expanded narrative, concluding the World War I story. This section covers 1918 through the armistice and explores the aftermath, including the influenza pandemic and the reshaping of nations. Multiple perspectives weave together to capture the war's climax and its lasting repercussions. Citations support key historical details. In March 1918, a German farmer's son, no longer just a teacher, but now a stormtrooper, stood in the mist near St. Quentin. Russia's collapse had freed 48 German divisions to move west. For weeks, he and his comrades trained in new infiltration tactics, moving in small groups, bypassing strongpoints, and attacking artillery from behind. They were supported by an unprecedented bombardment, 6,473 guns and 3,532 mortar. At 4 on the 21st of March, Operation Michael began. He leapt from his trench and advanced under a creeping barrage. The stormtroopers pushed 30 miles in the first days, overrunning 255 square kilometers and capturing 90,000 prisoners. For a moment, he dared to believe the stalemate was shattered. Yet success came at a cost. Supplies could not keep pace. His men were exhausted. By the 5th of April, the offensive stalled. The stormtrooper realized that after 3 long years of attrition, even a brilliant plan could not secure victory without reserves. He learned that Marshal Ferdinand Foch had been appointed commander-in-chief of all Allied armies, coordinating French, British, and now American forces. The German High Command launched successive attacks, but each time the pattern repeated: initial breakthroughs, then collapse. The stormtrooper watched the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, fall from the sky in April. He felt the war slipping from Germany's grasp. As he crouched in a captured trench, he whispered, could fresh American divisions, arriving at a rate of thousands per day, counterbalance his hard-won gains and turn the tide against him? Across the lines, a U.S. Marine from a Pittsburgh Steel family felt the ground tremble during the German spring onslaught. By the summer of 1918, over 1.4 million American troops were in France. He had volunteered, keen to prove himself and defend democracy. At Belleau Wood, he and his fellow Marines halted a German assault at a place named Devil Dog Ridge. He charged through wheat fields under machine gun fire, drove bayonet into soil, and held the line. The story of U.S. Marines fighting off seasoned stormtroopers bolstered Allied morale. On the 18th of July, the Allies launched their counteroffensive at the Second Battle of the Marne. The Marine now fought alongside French troops and British tanks. He marveled at the tanks' huge steel beasts rumbling across no man's land and knew there were 534 of them spearheading the upcoming Battle of Amiens. When the attack began on the 8th of August, objectives were reached with surprising speed. Field Marshal Ludendorff called it the Black Day of the German army, and the Marines sensed a new offensive momentum. As Amiens fell and news spread of Allied advances, he wondered if these coordinated attacks marked the beginning of the war's end or a new phase of unprecedented brutality. The fisherman's son who had survived Mons, the Somme and Passchendaele, now took part in the 100 Days Offensive, a relentless series of Allied attacks that lasted from the 8th of August until the armistice. He was older, hardened, and deeply weary. At Amiens, he watched 534 tanks roll through the morning mist, smashing German trenches. Though losses were heavy, the Allies pressed on. On the 29th of September, his unit advanced alongside the U.S. 27th Division, battering the formidable Hindenburg Line. They suffered 3,076 casualties, but they broke open Germany's last major defensive line and paved the way for further thrusts. He saw German soldiers surrendering in droves, their faces gaunt from blockade-induced hunger. Meanwhile, the Central Powers were unraveling. Bulgaria signed an armistice on the 29th of September. The Ottoman Empire capitulated on the 30th of October at Mudros, demobilizing its army and surrendering its ports. Austria-Hungary signed an armistice on the 3rd of November. As the British veteran fought on, he learned that Kaiser Wilhelm II had abdicated and fled. By early November, the war seemed to be ending, but each day still brought shellfire and death. With the Kaiser gone and the Hindenburg Line breached, he asked himself, would the shooting stop before he or his comrades fell to a final stray bullet? In autumn 1918, the Ners now battle-worn and resilient faced a foe far deadlier than shrapnel. The influenza pandemic swept through Europe, infecting about 500 million people and killing an estimated 50 to 100 million. She watched healthy soldiers collapse in hours, their skin turning blue. Hospitals overflowed. Wartime censors suppressed news in Germany, Britain, France, and the U.S., making it seem as if neutral Spain were hardest hit, hence the misnomer Spanish flu. In truth, the virus respected no borders. She moved between makeshift wards, often without masks because supplies had run out, and recorded names of men who had survived Verdun only to die of fever. She also treated civilians, including munitions workers sickened by toxic chemicals and flu. In letters, she read about suffrage. Women's contributions to munitions and hospitals had helped expand voting rights in Denmark, Norway, and Canada. She dared to imagine a future where hard work might be recognized. Yet, as she closed the eyes of a young recruit she had nursed through sepsis only to lose him to influenza, she questioned whether any reward could compensate for so much loss. As she watched the fever spread, she wondered whether the war's end would halt the pandemic, or whether this silent killer would continue claiming lives long after the guns fell quiet. In East Africa, Mwita still trudged through bush and savanna. He had marched across multiple colonies, carrying ammunition for German forces seeking to divert Allied resources. By 1918, their small army evaded British and Portuguese forces living off raids. Mwita heard rumors of an armistice in Europe but could not confirm them. In November, he encountered a British patrol carrying a newspaper. He learned that Germany had signed an armistice and that the war was over. On the 25th of November 1918, 2 weeks after fighting had ceased in France, Leto Vorbeck surrendered his remaining 1,500 men in northern Rhodesia. Mwita laid down his burdens, but he did not yet understand how much his life and land had been changed by a war he never chose. As he walked home through scorched villages, he asked, would colonial powers now recognize his sacrifice, or would new borders simply bring different masters? The Ottoman gunner who had fought at Gaza and retreated from Jerusalem now heard of new crisis. Bulgaria's surrender isolated the empire. British General Allenby's forces and Arab rebels captured Damascus. Meanwhile, mutinies erupted in the Ottoman army. With supply lines cut and morale shattered, the government signed the Armistice of Mudros on the 30th of October 1918. The terms were harsh: complete demobilization, Allied occupation of forts, and control over railways and the capital. The officer was ordered to lay down arms. He felt a mix of relief and humiliation. With the empire's collapse, new national movements would emerge. He wondered what homeland he would return to and whether the promises made to Arabs and Armenians would be honored. As he handed his rifle to a British officer, he thought, did this surrender mark peace or the beginning of new struggles in his fractured homeland? In Berlin, a railway clerk too young for the front experienced the war's end differently. He endured years of food shortages due to the British blockade, saw his infant sister weakened by malnutrition, and watched socialist agitators fill the streets. When the Kaiser abdicated on the 9th of November, crowds toppled statues and declared a republic. On the 11th of November at 5 a.m., German representatives signed an armistice agreement with Marshal Foch. Hostilities would cease at 11 a.m. The clerk read the terms posted in town. Germany must evacuate occupied territories, hand over weapons, and release prisoners. He listened to the church bells ring at 11, mingled with cheering and weeping. He wondered what the cost of defeat would be and what peace really meant. As he closed his office ledger that day, he pondered whether the harsh conditions of the armistice would heal Germany or sow seeds of resentment that might one day sprout again. When word of the armistice reached the British munitions factory, whistles blew and workers embraced. Margaret felt a surge of joy. No more night shifts, no more fear of explosions. But news arrived about influenza casualties. She mourned colleagues who succumbed to the virus. Soon after, she learned that women over 30 in Britain would finally get the vote, partly due to women's wartime contributions. She attended rallies for equal pay and read headlines about the Treaty of Versailles negotiations. She sent a care package to her cousin, still recovering in hospital, knowing the pandemic raged on. As she stitched her first non-uniform dress in years, she wondered whether her newfound rights would endure and how society would treat women like her once men returned. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, a young diplomat from a small Balkan kingdom sat at a long table, watching as the great powers redrew Europe's map. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on the 28th of June 1919, forced Germany to accept sole guilt for the war, pay reparations, and cede territory. Additional treaties carved up empires. The Treaty of Saint-Germain dissolved Austria-Hungary and created nations like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. The Treaty of Neuilly punished Bulgaria by ceding lands and access to the Aegean. The Treaty of Trianon cut Hungary's territory and population dramatically. The diplomat celebrated his homeland's recognition, but worried about minority populations left across new borders. He noticed that while the conference aimed to secure peace, it also spawned grievances that might fester. As he dipped his pen to sign a treaty, he thought, would these lines on paper create lasting peace or merely pause the flames before they reignited? Years later, the fisherman's son, now a middle-aged man, returned to his village. He saw war memorials in town squares, each inscribed with names of the fallen. He learned that World War I had resulted in at least 16 million military deaths and total casualties estimated at 37 million. He visited his brother's grave, lost in Flanders. He read about global changes. Poland re-emerged. The Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires vanished. New states were born. Women who had munition scars on their hands cast ballots for the first time. Yet he also noticed joblessness, inflation, and political unrest. As he sat by the river, he thought about the stormtrooper he had faced, the nurse who had bandaged his wounds, the porter in Africa carrying shells, the marine charging through below wood, the clerk witnessing revolution, and the diplomatic signatures that followed. Watching his children run through a field where once there had been trenches, he whispered a silent prayer that they would not one day stand, as he had in another bloody harvest of mud and steel.